Okay, let's just start here. Well, welcome, Rachel. You're editor-in-chief of Smashing Magazine. Today you're going to talk about a lot of new stuff in CSS. And if I'm correct, you have already changed your presentations a couple of times to put some new things in there. So I'm just really excited what we're going to see. If people have questions, they can just put them in the they can put them in the chat right there, and then we'll just look at them afterwards. And if you want to have captions, then you can find them on smashedby/coming soon, that you can see on that slide as well. And I'm wishing you a wonderful talk. Enjoy.
Okay. All right, I shall have a go at sharing my screen and see what happens.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's me, and hopefully I can see my notes. There we go. Okay. Hopefully you can see my slides. Someone let me know in the chat that you can see my slides, because that's always good. Hooray! Excellent. Right. It's always nice to know that something is happening. Okay, so I'm going to talk for a little while just about some of the new bits and pieces that are coming into CSS. Most of this stuff has some sort of browser implementation, so you can try it out. But really, it's just new things, interesting things, the things that have caught my interest. Because things are actually getting into browsers an awful lot faster these days. So it's pretty cool to sort of see that process and to be able to share that with you. So I thought I'd start with something which is kind of good news, because it's actually progressing since, in fact, I wrote a bit of an article about this on Smashing, and things have progressed since then. Because in CSS Grid, we can use gap, column gap, and row gap properties, and that defines the gaps between rows and columns, or both at the same time. The column gap feature also appears in multiple column layout, and that lets you create gaps between columns. So while you could use margins to space out grid items, the nice thing with the gap feature is you only get gaps between your items. You don't end up with extra space on the start and end of the grid. And that's pretty much how we've had to do spacing in Flexbox. If you want space between flex items, you end up having to use a margin. And if you don't want a margin at the start and end, you end up using a negative margin to remove it. So we do something like this. Now, it'd also be really nice to have that gap feature in Flexbox too. And the good news is that we do. It's been implemented for a while in Firefox, and it shipped in the last version of Chrome. So you can just do this, just use gap like you do in grid layout to make gaps between your flex items. Now, the Flexbox gap implementation kind of shows up a few interesting things. Now, you might remember, if you were an early adopter of grid layout, we used to have these properties grid gap, grid row gap, and grid column gap. And they were first shipped when grid first was shipped in browsers. But in much the same way as the alignment features, things like justify content, align content, first appeared in Flexbox and then became available to grid, it was decided that the gap features were useful to more than just grid, so they were moved and renamed. So the gap features are also in the box alignment specification, which is where those alignment features from Flexbox ended up as well. Now then, we don't want to have multiple properties prefixed with a spec name, because that gets all a little bit verbose. So they were also renamed at the same time to drop the grid prefix. Now, if you have got sort of fairly early grid code that uses those grid properties, that's fine. They'll be maintained as aliases of the non-prefix properties, just like any other prefix things you might use. Though anything that now supports grid or supports just the gap, row gap, column gap properties. So gap property in Flexbox has got a separate listing there on can I use, and you can see there that it's now in Chrome and therefore Chromium-based Edge. The browser that doesn't have it at the moment is Safari, of the sort of modern browsers. So you might think, oh, well, I could use the gap feature in Flexbox and use feature queries to detect it, to test for support, and use margin as a fallback. But unfortunately, that's not the case, because feature queries test for a name and value. So if I want to test for grid support, I can do this sort of thing. So I can say @supports display grid and then do my grid stuff inside that feature query. The problem with testing for the gap property is that, well, gap works in grid layout in, for instance, Safari. So if we test for gap 20 pixels, it does match, even though it doesn't match within Flexbox. There's not actually a way to test for support within a particular layout mode. So you can't sort of say, I want to have gap in Flexbox. I did raise that as an issue with the CSS Working Group, but it turns out that it's actually quite a hard thing to fix, because all that the feature query does is check that the browser understands that property and value. And so it's a difficult thing to fix. So this is just kind of a little bit of a problem while we're waiting for that Flexbox gap support to roll out everywhere. So something else, aspect ratios. Now this is one of these problems that we've had on the web for a long time. Some things have got an aspect ratio that we want to preserve. Now we have images and video. Now if you place those directly onto your page, so using the HTML image or video element, then it keeps the aspect ratio that it arrives with. We don't stretch things. So unless you forcibly change the width or the height, things keep the aspect ratio. The problem comes when we want to add an element that doesn't have an aspect ratio and make one dimensional flexible, and then have the other maintain a specific aspect ratio. Now this, you tend to come across this when you want to embed a video with an iframe. And you embed your iframe, but the iframe itself doesn't have an aspect ratio. Other things you might want to do are make like perfectly square areas on your grid, which means that one dimension needs to react to another. Now the way that we typically deal with this is by way of the padding hack. Now that uses the fact that padding in the block direction is copied from the inline direction if we use a percentage. And it's not a very elegant solution to the problem, but in most cases it works absolutely fine, and that's what we've been doing for a long time. So the aspect ratio property seeks to solve it, though, to kind of mean we don't have to do this weird hacky thing and explain it to everyone that that's what we have to do. And that will let us specify an aspect ratio for a length. So here I've created a grid layout and I've set my grid items to use a 1:1 aspect ratio. So the width of the items is determined by their grid column track size, which is flexible. And then the height is being copied from that to make a square. Now, just for fun, I rotated the items. Now that works in Chrome Canary at the moment. You'd need to implement experimental web platform features. But this is one of the things that is coming through. You know, we've got a specification for it. It's starting to be implemented in browsers and will solve a problem that we've had to deal with for years. And I really like these small things. I like these things that fix stuff that we've just been doing in a weird way forever. It's kind of nice to see an official way of doing it. An interesting sort of side note to this is that this property is being used internally by modern browsers. If you add a width and a height to your HTML image element, like we used to do in the past, the nice thing about that is that internally that's sort of used as the values, and you don't get the jiggling as the images load. But of course, when we started doing responsive design, we're giving everything, you know, max width 100%. And so we stopped putting widths and heights on the HTML element because we didn't actually know how tall things were going to be. So what browsers did very quickly, once this sort of aspect ratio unit was being worked out, was they implemented it internally. So if you add a width and a height on your images, the browser will take that, work out the aspect ratio, and as your images are loading, things won't jiggle around. So you just get a bit of nice performance there for free, and browsers just support that. So it really is time to start adding width and height back onto your images again, so that you can benefit from this, which a lot of browsers now support. So something else that we've got coming up. Developers often look at CSS Grid, particularly when we first were showing demos of the spec, and assume that it would be able to be used to create like a masonry layout or the sort of layout you see on Pinterest. Now, a lot of demos do look like that, but Grid isn't really masonry. Now, to explain, you kind of need to know what a masonry layout is. In a typical masonry layout, items display by row, so they're displaying across the row. Once the first row is filled, new items start to fill another row. But if some of the items in the first row are shorter than others, the second row items kind of raise up and fill in the gap. So you get something like this, where it's all sort of jiggling around and lining up. Now, could Grid be used as a masonry layout? one of the engineers at Mozilla thought that yes, that would work, and has created a prototype of the functionality. Now you can test that out in Firefox nightly. You need to enable a flag. It's layout, CSS grid, template, masonry value enabled. You'll see in the examples I've got. And you do that by going to about config in the Firefox nightly URL bar. But if you search around in the values there, you'll find it. So then you can do something like this. And you get a masonry layout. As I say, the examples for this talk has got one. You can have a look if you enable the right flags in Firefox. Now that's pretty cool. I think it'll be very useful. A lot of people want to do that. It doesn't perform very well when you do it with JavaScript. I kind of wonder if the grid spec is the place to define this very specific layout. I did write up some of my thoughts if you want to have a look at them, because it's not really a grid thing, because you end up with not a grid essentially, and whether that matters or not, I don't know. It's something that's up for discussion, but it's pretty cool that we're looking at ways to do that sort of layout, because it's a very popular way to lay things out. And so sticking with grid things, we've had support for the subgrid value of grid template columns and grid template rows in Firefox for some time. And what this means is if you declare the value of those properties as subgrid, rather than having to create your own track listing for that, it just sort of copies in the track listing of the area that your element spans over, which means you can essentially inherit your grid tracks down through children and grandchildren and their children as far down as you want to go. So if you're using Firefox, you can test this out. I've got lots of examples on my site, Grid by Example, and you can play around with it. I'm not going to talk a huge amount about this today. There's lots I could go into with Subgrid, but there's articles on Smashing Magazine. You can play with my examples if you've not kind of heard of it before. The reason I wanted to bring it up is because for a while it's been this Firefox only feature. They implemented it. We've been playing around with it. We've been saying, hey, we'd really like to have this in other browsers. The spec actually went sort of moved on and became a candidate recommendation. And we were like, hey, we'd like to be able to use this. We want it in Chrome. And that is happening. In June, there was a Chromium blog post announcing that the Microsoft Edge team, who are now obviously working on Chromium, they're working to re-implement grid layout into the Layout NG engine, which is Chromium's next generation layout engine. And part of that work will involve adding subgrid support. And that's really why subgrid is lagged behind. Chrome are working on Layout NG. They're kind of, rebuilding a great chunk of their engine. And so things are kind of queued up behind that. So adding features to browsers isn't a quick process, but the Microsoft team actually brought us grid layout in the first place, the early prefixed implementation that shipped in IE10. So that team know about grid. They know how it works. They were, involved with the spec. And so we'll hopefully see fairly soon, we'll have something we can test in Chrome, and we're going to start to get subgrid, which will be really brilliant. So here's something else that I quite like. We've got this prefers reduced data media feature. Now, what this will let us do as developers is check to see if our visitor has enabled data saving in the device. So if they've said, I want to save data, perhaps because they're on a really expensive connection, we can actually react to that, and we can not load big images perhaps by default, or video or anything else that might use up data. So we can help them to conserve their data by knowing that they've toggled that feature. So we do it like this, just like a media query. We're saying, prefers reduced data, no preference. They've not set data saving, and then you could, download your larger images or what have you. Now, if you download Chrome Canary and enable experimental web platform features, then you can actually emulate a person browsing with data saving enabled. So this is something that they're working on implementing. I don't think anyone's got this feature live in their browser yet, but it's coming. And it's a sort of thing that if you were building a brand new site now, then maybe you could think about, doing some things using that feature, because by the time, it's sort of your site comes out, it could well be there's some browser support. It's the sort of thing that's going to enhance your site in the future for people as it starts to come in to browsers. There's a whole bunch of these things, these user preference media features. and they're part of Media Queries Level 5. There's a bunch of other things, some of which have already been implemented. We have things like prefers reduced motion. Now, if you say you want to reduce motion, then that means that your user has toggled the reduce motion feature in their device, and they don't want things moving around, so you could stop having so many animations. Prefers color scheme. Do they want to have dark mode? So you can tailor your CSS to suit. I really love this stuff. It's letting us react to exactly where our visitor is and the kind of what environment they're in and the things that they care about. You know, if they want to save data or they want to have a dark color scheme, you know, we can actually react to that. So it's kind of like the next step for responsive design. It's not just about their screen size, it's about all these other things about their environment and really making things work for them. Another little thing, marker. This marker pseudo element lets us target the list marker. So at a very simple level, we can target the list bullet and change its color or size. And that used to be impossible. You could only get the whole list item, the text and the marker. So we can sort of do something like this. We can, you know, change the marker itself. We've changed the text to white, but we're turning the marker black. Which will give us this. Support for marker is already in Firefox. It's now in Chrome Beta. I think it's going out in Chrome 86. Now, the nice thing about marker is that you don't just have to use list bullets on actual lists. You can use marker on other elements. So, for instance, I might have a heading and I want to have like a little icon next to it. Now, if I turn the heading into a list item with display list item, it gets a marker, and I can then replace that with an emoji. And I've replaced this with an emoji of my favorite vegetable, which is broccoli. And so we get this, because the nice thing with markers is they kind of hang out off the edge of the text, don't they? And so it's quite a nice way to do that. So there's something you can do with markers. And remember, you can turn things that aren't list items into list items with CSS. That's absolutely fine. That's not going to cause a problem. And then you've got the marker to play with. And with this new marker pseudo element, you can actually edit it and change it and do stuff. So that's pretty cool. Now, I did say in the description for this talk, everything had browser implementation, but then a new feature came up, which I was really excited about, and I just wanted to kind of add on to the end. Because again, this is one of these things that just solves a problem that we have. I'm sure we've all had the issue where you've got some text and you're trying to line it up maybe with some other text, or you're looking at the spaces between text, and it doesn't quite work because your text box has extra space in it. It's not tightly wrapped to the actual characters. You've got a bit of extra space, and it's different depending on the line height, and it's different depending on fonts. It's just a nuisance. It's been a nuisance forever. We've worked around it. That's the web. But the leading trim property is actually going to give you the opportunity to trim off that extra space. It's going to look something like this. I took this example from an article I'm going to give you the URL for because it is excellent and you should all read it if you're interested in this property. So we're basically going to be able to trim, we're saying leading trim both there. We're basically telling the browser with text edge, you know, where the edges are of the text, and then we're using leading trim to trim off both the top and the bottom there. Now, there is a really brilliant article that came out, I think this week, which just explains the whole thing with some really lovely examples. So it's really worth going and looking, because it actually explains why we have this extra space in the first place and how this new property is going to help us to control it. So in the resources for this talk, I've got a link to this article, and I really would suggest that you go and have a look at it because it's so nicely done. And it also has a link to the CSS Working Group repository where they're discussing this issue, because they'd like some feedback. And that's a really good time to go into the kind of end of this talk. Because if you have some feedback on that issue or on anything else, please remember that anyone can offer feedback and anyone can contribute specifications. A really, really simple way is just that, is to see something that the working group want feedback and go and add your comments. If you've got a use case, if you look at it and think, hang on, I know of a thing this isn't going to solve, we'd like to know about that because that could go into the thinking around making the feature. So here's an example issue, something I raised. But anyone can comment on things. Anyone can raise an issue. You don't have to be sort of specially granted permission to come and raise issues. Just tell us the sort of things that are going on. Use cases, as I say, are really, really useful. If you're raising a new issue or commenting on an existing one, explain the use case you have and the problem that you're trying to solve. Features are likely to be added if they solve problems, not just because they're possible and it might be quite cool, because there's all sorts of things that we could add for that reason. So add why it would be helpful and the problems it's solving. If you're already doing it, say with JavaScript, you have to do something with JavaScript, like the Masonry thing. That's a really good thing to show. Hey, look, I did this with JavaScript. Doesn't perform very well, but it solved the problem. It would be great if this could be part of CSS. That's a really great use case because people can see it and talk about it. If you like reading specs, if you've read a few specs, and often they'll have notes in them saying, hey, we could do some examples here or diagrams. If that's something that you can do, add a note to the spec, add a note to the issues and sort of say, hey, I could contribute some diagrams here. I've got some ideas. Generally, people would prefer an issue. Spec editors prefer issues at first rather than a pull request, because it lets you discuss everything before you actually go ahead and actually try and add something to a spec. It's easier to do that in an issue. If you actually raise an issue or comment and it gets discussed, you can go back to that issue and you will see when it's been discussed by the CSS Working Group. All of our notes, our discussions that happen are all minuted on IRC, and after the discussions happened, it gets posted back so you can see if we have talked about it. Other place to go is the WSICG, that's the Web Platform Incubator Group. Other things broader than CSS and very early stage stuff gets talked about there. So you can check about the discussions there and see if you've got anything to contribute. What I would say is it will probably take longer than you think for changes to be made. If you're sort of interacting with this process, it's probably not going to help the project you're working on today or even things you're working on next week. It takes a while to get things through the process. And silence doesn't mean that your issues are being ignored. It's probably just that no one's working on that particular thing right now. Quicker ways to help are to raise browser bugs. If you find a problem in a browser, go and tell that browser vendor about it. That is really, really useful, and that will help get things fixed. And it shows that you're interested and that people are interested in that feature being fixed too. And really importantly, if you want to raise browser bugs, don't just point to your website and say it's broken here, because by the time an engineer looks at it, your website might have changed because you fixed the bug in a different way. Create a reduced test case, upload the files or point to a code pen or something, and then they can go and look at that, and it's not tied to your particular website that might change. It's always worth going and looking at browser bug trackers. You can star the things that you are interested in, because again, that shows interest. It shows that you want that feature. Some of these things I've shown you aren't there in live browsers yet, but it's really worth looking at things when they're behind flags. That's the best time to make changes to a spec, when something is behind a feature flag. Once it's out there shipped in live browsers, we actually can't do a lot about it because it's already out there. So if you want to make changes, if you want to actually impact the process, do that while things are behind flags. Because once they're out there, they end up not being able to be taken back. This is a partial list of things we can't take back, that things that are in CSS that are weird that just have to stay there. We also have tests for the web platform. If you like writing tests, you can actually test features. There's a whole bunch of documentation here at the web platform tests repository. There's a documentation to actually get started writing tests, which can be as simple as, does this thing look like that thing? And that just means that when a browser launches the new feature, it passes the tests, and we know that it works exactly the same way as other browsers. And if you are actually interested in getting deeper into the process, many people who work on CSS actually started by writing tests. So that's a bunch of ways you can actually help to move the platform forward by commenting on our issues, raising new issues, contributing examples, raising browser bugs, writing tests. Do get involved with it. I mean, it's how I kind of got involved with the CSS Working Group and things, was just because I was doing this stuff around the edges. And you learn a lot by getting involved. It's an interesting world to be involved in. So that's a quick fire run through all of this stuff. thank you very much for listening, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much. That was really great. So much new and exciting stuff.
Yeah, there's always new stuff. It's really good at the moment with CSS. There's lots of new stuff happening. So
yeah, and it's also kind of just cool to see how stuff is like stuff is being supported like pretty fast. Like it goes pretty fast. And that's
it's a lot faster than it used to be. Yeah, and that's I mean, things still take quite a long time if you're wanting it for your project. It seems like this is going to take forever, but actually things are moving a lot faster than they used to. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, really cool. Let's see. There were a few questions. Laura Colback, hi there. She asked the question: does Masonry preserve the source, like the order, or like tab order?
It's going to have the same issue that Grid has, basically, that yes, you could end up with. I mean, by default, it's going to be, because it's laid out by row, by default, it's going to behave reasonably well. But obviously, if it's tied in with the Grid spec particularly, then you could, end up positioning things within that, which are then out of order. So it's going to have the same issues that Grid has, that you can end up with things out of order. And you need to be careful with that. It's something I would like to solve, this issue of the sort of the tab order and the display order, but it's not an easy issue to solve. But I think it's going to be the same. It's going to be the same as Grid, basically. That you could end up with a mess. You can probably mitigate it if you're careful.
Yeah, and then also like what you said, and like the Grid order. Is that what was that meant by design, or was it more like it's just really hard to make that happen?
Well, we don't really have a way. Essentially, there's not really a good way to sort of indicate that at the moment. I mean, you could make a mess with absolute positioning, so it's always been a problem. Yeah. You can do that, but when Firefox first implemented Flexbox, they actually did make it follow the visual order, which if we just had Flexbox, it might have worked all right. But with Grid, sometimes you actually want it to follow the logical order, and sometimes you might want to mess around with it. So I think we do need some kind of switch. We need a way as the developer to say, I want the browser to follow the visual order here, and actually tell it. I think that's what we ultimately need, but it's a hard problem to solve.
I truly believe so. It would also, it would be great if we would have the option.
Yeah, it would be nice to be able to indicate in some way, and I think that's probably where we'll end up with, but it just might take some time.
Totally get that. Also, somebody asked, any idea when Grid animation comes to Chrome and comes to other browsers?
Yeah, so because in Grid you can animate the column tracks, the sort of track sizing and the gap sizing. I don't know what the status of that is in Chrome. I would imagine it is in the same way that Subgrid has been held up behind Layout NG. I imagine it's probably the same thing. They've not been implementing those features because they're waiting to re-implement Grid in this new layout engine. So it may well be, I'd have to look, but it may well be that that's the case, is that that's just another Grid thing that is waiting for that re-implementation. Yeah,
and do you think that's like a hard thing to solve?
No, I think it's just priorities. As I say, because Chrome are doing Layout NG, I think there's a whole bunch of stuff that is just living behind that chunk of work. Yeah. It's a bit like any product. If you've got a big thing you've got to ship, there's all sorts of bits that you want to touch, but you can't touch them yet because you've got to do the big thing first. And I think that's where they are with quite a few things.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah. Let's see. Do we have any more questions? Did I miss any of them? Oh, it was also really interesting to see once you started talking about marker, like everybody got really excited.
It's funny. It's these little, they're kind of like small things. We haven't got at the moment anything big like Grid about to land. But actually, I think as a working web developer, often it's little stuff. I think, people get really excited about what seems like a very small feature, but it's fixing a problem that we've all had for years and we've just hacked around. I think that new people learning CSS now, that if they looked at some of the stuff we have been doing in the past, but what on earth were you doing? I mean, just even things like floats, what were you doing? And why was this okay?
Yeah.
You know, so I think that's, you know, I like the little stuff. You know, as someone who builds websites, I like the little stuff.
Yeah. Also, like, so how does it work with like marker? What can you put in there? Is it just text, or can you also put anything in there?
We can put emojis and things. You can do some basic styling of it. I can't remember the list of properties offhand. There's basically a few things. You can't do absolutely anything with marker, but you can do some basic styling of the default markers, and you can then obviously put images in. You can use emojis and so on. So yeah, but basically it works with the light generated content essentially. So you can, you know, whatever you used to put into the content property, you can use for marker.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. I did not know that. So that it feels like a better way to solve stuff than using the before and the afters, right? Like, let's see. Do we have any more questions? Yeah, can I use? Yeah, and like
browser support.
That's what Sean.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, the thing with browser support with all this stuff, I mean, a lot of this stuff, there's lots of bits and pieces that you can just use, and browsers that don't support them just get a simpler experience. It's fine. Obviously, feature queries for a lot of these things will let you use them safely and kind of, you know, put that code to one side. I mean, I think for a lot of people, IE11 is still an issue. People need to support IE11, and there's kind of not a lot you can do other than say, well, is it okay to have a simpler experience? But really, every project's different, and there's not a rule of thumb. It's kind of, as someone said in the chat, you know, look at your own Google Analytics and see how many people you're talking about. I mean, the other thing I always say is make sure you're talking about the same thing. If you say to stakeholders, you know, we're not going to support IE11, what they think is you're going to like lock everybody in IE11 out of the website, right? And that what you might actually be thinking is we're going to give them a simpler experience. We're not going to support them with all of the bells and whistles. Now, that's a very different thing. So if you can talk about like how much it might cost to try and do all of this stuff for IE11, whereas if you do the simpler experience, it's not going to cost so much to do the development and the future proofing of not having to have all this legacy code. I think you need to be very clear that you're not locking people necessarily out of the website, unless you are. I mean, if that's what you want to do. But, you know, for most of us, it might just be a case of you're going to give them a simpler experience. And I've seen this time and time again where people have been, I've been told I've got to fully support IE11. And what it's come down to is that the stakeholders haven't understood that what you're talking about is still letting them use the site, but just in a slightly simpler way.
Let's see. I think there are still a few questions. So I just suggest we're just going to answer them. Also, if you would like to see Miriam Suzanne talk, she's starting again right now on the main stage. And I think we're just going to hang out for a little bit here to see if there are any more questions. And then we're going to close here as well. Let's see. Derek asked, can you manage the margins or the spacings around the marker?
I don't think you can. I think you end up needing to essentially put in a space character after it. So put it, because you can't, I don't think you can mess around. There's only a very limited amount of things you can do at the moment. I mean, that might change on the spec. Yeah. So I think, I think what people tend to do is end up putting in like an empty space character after the marker to make sure that you don't end up, which is slightly, but I think like a lot of these things, it's like what can we do that won't break everything? But most decisions around CSS, it's like a lot of these things where you're touching like legacy stuff. It's like, what can we do that won't actually break any of the web? Because that's a kind of a fundamental principle of designing CSS is we don't break the web. Yeah. We don't break what went before.
Yeah. Let's see. I think we're about there.
Someone asking about the semantics of changing a heading to a list item. Now, it should be fine. I would test it because we have had issues and we still have some issues where changing the value of display is damaging semantics. I would test it to make sure that the browser and the devices that you're talking about still think it's a heading. I think it's probably okay. I know there are issues with tables and lists and things, and they are being kind of worked on by browsers. In the display spec, changing the value of display should not change the semantics. We have got bugs in browsers with that, but it shouldn't do it. But so I think really, if you are changing the value of display, particularly on these things that have semantic values, I would test to make sure that you're not doing anything odd, that it's not, that it's correct in the accessibility tree and so on, because we do have bugs in browsers. They are bugs, and hopefully they will go away.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Are we there? I think we're there.
I think that's most of the stuff I've seen. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Slides are available. Yep. Links you can find it there as well. Thank you so much, Rachel, for your time as well.
Yep, it's been fun. Oh well, enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.